We'll get started in a moment. Thanks everyone for joining. Can you go grab some water or some tea before we dive in? Thanks for being here. All right, I think we are ready to dive in and get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on the 2024 webinar, our very first webinar of 2024, GIA's annual research on support for arts and culture. And I'm Sherilyn Seeley, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Before we begin our webinar, please take a moment to review the Zoom features. You can go on to the next slide so that you can have an optimal experience with us today. If you have any questions for our tech team during the webinar, you can feel free to use the chat function and message LGC Tech Jess, and Jess will help you right away. If you have any questions for our presenters, however, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will collect all of the questions and direct them to our presenters during the Q&A section of the webinar. If you'd like your experience to include live captioning, you can select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, as you can see on the slide here, and select show subtitles. So we can go into the next slide. So in the winter 2024 edition of the GIA Reader, which we'll add a link in the chat right now for you to have handy, the latest edition of GIA's Funder Snapshot includes Foundation Grants to Arts and Culture 2021, based on the most recently completed year of Candid data, and Public Funding for the Arts 2022, prepared by the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. But how have things changed since the last GIA Funder Snapshots back in 2023? You might remember we had one in February, our public funding snapshot in February. We had our foundation funding snapshot in October, and now we're in February of the following year. So how have things changed? And so we're glad to answer that question with our incredible presenters, Stephen Lawrence, Philanthropy, and nonprofit consultant for Stephen Lawrence Consulting, Mohja Rhoads, research manager for National Assembly State Arts Agencies, Nakyung Rhee, research associate for the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and Ryan Stubbs, senior director of research, National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So we're so glad to get into this conversation with everyone, and I am going to kick it right over to Stephen to get us started on the presentation.
Well, thanks, Sherilyn, and it's always a pleasure. I so appreciate Grantmakers in the Arts inviting me to work on these snapshots, and it's also really great that we've basically gone from 2020 data in October to 2021 data in January. So in 3 months, you'll get a year's more current perspective on the data. But before jumping into that, I want to acknowledge how much I've always admired the commitment of Grantmakers in the Arts to data and to the value of data in informing grant-making practice. So where we're going to begin, for those of you who have, I think I went too far. There we go. For those of you who are familiar with the art snapshots that have been prepared by previously Foundation Center and then Candid, these are based on Candid's Foundation 1000 grant sample. So this includes all the grants of $10,000 or more awarded by 1,000 of the largest US foundations. Now, of course, this is only a tiny fraction of the more than 100,000 grant-making independent and family, corporate, community, and operating foundations. But nonetheless, because it's capturing giving by the largest funders, it represents about 2/5 of giving by all foundations. And, as you can see in the third bullet here, the 2021 data includes over 189,000 grants totaling $48.6 billion. And of course, I want to thank my friends and former colleagues at Candid for all of their help in creating and accessing these data. So this past fall, I had the opportunity to revisit the foundation grant making data through 2020 after a number of years of being away, because I'd actually created these snapshots way back in the day. So it was really exciting to come back. But it also, I found a number of things that were surprising. And for those of you who were able to participate in the October webinar, you will hear some similar things today. But I think there are actually some, I would call them relatively brighter spots that showed up in the data when we could look at 2021. So I'll try to highlight those this afternoon. All right, so let's start off with what giving for arts and culture represents as a share of overall foundation giving in this Foundation 1000 data set. And as you can see, the share of arts grant dollars that are represented declined from 13% in 2010 and has been at 7% for basically since 2019 through 2021. So what I would say is a slightly more positive finding is it seems like this share has stabilized, which is positive. I'll also note that for 2010, there was an exceptionally large $1 billion grant from the Walton Family Foundation to Crystal Bridges, which had certainly impacted the share that's being represented there. By comparison, in the 2021 data set, the largest grant reported was for 115 million, and I'll actually talk about that later on. That said, just to give you context, back in the first half of the 2000s, the arts consistently accounted for between 13 and 14% of overall foundation giving, but had dropped to about 12% by the time of the Great Recession. So you can see where it was, relatively speaking, we're at about half that share now. Also affecting these shares are the fact that in recent years, Candid changed its methodology. So up until about 2016, 2017, Candid was basing these shares on the primary purpose of a grant. So it had to be primarily about the arts. It could be secondarily about something else. Candid changed the methodology to count all grants that had either a primary or secondary focus on arts and culture. What that means is that 7% share that we're seeing in more recent years, if it were following the same methodology, would likely be a bit lower, although we can't say exactly by how much. All right, in this next slide, we overlaid the share of number of grants for arts and culture out of the total Foundation 1000 set. And this is helpful because this isn't going to be impacted by especially large grants in any particular years. And what you can also see is there has been a gradual decline in share for arts and culture with a bigger dip in 2019 and 2020. And of course, 2020 being the first year of the pandemic. And that certainly had an impact on overall giving trends. And we'll talk a bit more about that. What I will say is on the positive side, the share of number of grants did rebound a bit to 11% in the latest year in 2021. By the same token, this is still less than the share we saw as recently as 2018. With that, let's take a look at changes in actual grant dollars. And again, this is based on the Foundation 1000 set. And as you can see, actual grant dollars from 2010 to 2021 went up from $2.4 billion to $3.5 billion. So it's up by more than $1 billion. Of course, let's take inflation into account. And what we see is, what is, in a sense, more positive than when I spoke to you in October. When we looked at the data through 2020, what you saw is adjusting for inflation, giving for arts and culture was basically flat among this group of funders at 2.4 billion. Now we come to the 2021 data, it's actually gone up by about 400 million to $2.8 billion. So that is certainly positive. However, you want to keep in mind that while arts and culture giving then adjusted for inflation, was up about 17% during this period. Overall foundation giving for the Foundation 1000 after inflation was up by half, actually 51%, so just a smidge over half during this period. So if arts and culture giving had kept pace with the growth of overall foundation giving, the total after inflation would be about $3.6 billion, or roughly $800 million more than what we're seeing here. Now, in the Arts Funding at 25 report, which I worked on for Grantmakers in the Arts several years ago, I looked at the factors potentially accounting for declining shares of funding for arts and culture. And one was, in a sense, on a positive note, that there wasn't a lot of attrition among top funders for the arts. I looked at a 14-year period from 2000 to 2014. And so that was positive. Most of the arts funders were still funding the arts. However, their actual or relative giving had been reduced during this period. Another analysis I did for that report was to look at what share of foundations funded arts and culture based on decade of establishment. And what I saw is for foundations established in the 1990s, about 80% of them provided at least some support for the arts. It may even just be one grant, but there was some type of arts and culture related grant making. For those established in earlier decades, the shares were even higher. In contrast, foundations established from 2000 onward, for those funders, the share was 63%. And what I noted in that piece was that it appears that the case for arts funding that attracted so many foundations in recent decades may not be resonating as strongly with newer donors. Well, let's take one more comparative look at the overall funding data. And what we're looking at here is the change in grant dollars and change in number of grants based on a matched set of funders. So within the Foundation 1000 data sets for the year 2020 and 2021, 820 of those 1,000 foundations were included in both sets. And you're always going to have funders moving in and out, particularly at the lower end of the giving range. So another positive finding in the latest data is that, in fact, arts and culture giving matched what was happening with overall foundation giving for this matched set. They were both up about 5%. And both showed a decrease in grant dollars, a decrease in number of grants of about 4%. Of course, it's important to keep in mind, 2020 was also the first year of the pandemic. And there was a lot of exceptional grant making that was happening, a lot of foundations making additional grants. So I'm not at all surprised to see that dip in the number of grants. But as I say, the fact that it's consistent with the overall trend, I would certainly consider to be positive. Next, this was, when I talked about the data in October, this was something that I said surprised me, but shouldn't have surprised me. And this was looking at the share of giving accounted for by various foundation types. And what I would draw your attention to in this slide is the fact that giving by corporate and operating foundations accounted for close to a quarter of overall foundation giving for arts and culture among the Foundation 1000. Community foundations were just accounting for 4%. Well, you come 11 years later, and my round chart got a little squished, so allowing for that. You can see that, in a sense, it's been reversed. Community foundations were 4% accounting for 4% of dollars in 2010. Now, operating and corporate foundations are accounting for 4%, and community foundations are accounting for 1 in every 5 arts and culture grant dollars that we're accounting for in the sample. Among the top foundations, the 4th ranked Chicago Community Trust, 7th ranked Columbus Foundations, they were high on the list. The Silicon Valley Community Foundation also ranked among the top 10. So certainly, the growth in community foundations as a vehicle for the growing number of affluent individuals to channel their philanthropy is clearly showing up in this trend. On the flip side, for corporate foundations, as we know, the impact of corporate mergers really going back to the 1990s and just continuing has very much impacted the connection between where corporations are headquarters and the communities in which they're located. So that tended to be very closely tied in earlier decades, certainly mid-century, even into the 70s. And there's no longer as tight a connection as there was, and we can see the result here. So what is arts and culture supporting? What's being funded? Well, this slide is actually showing something a little interesting and different, which may be a one-year blip, but we'll see. So typically, performing arts and museums account for the largest shares of funding. And for the most part, it's been performing arts. Really, museums will account for the largest share of grant dollars in years where they're just like with the Crystal Bridges grant, when there's just exceptionally large grants, generally capital grants being made for cultural institutions. So what's interesting is that trend, performing arts accounting for the largest share is held. Museums, however, fell to third place based on share of grant dollars in 2021. And let me just acknowledge that it wasn't until this morning I noticed I misspelled museums. So allow me that. But that said, with museums, I'll note, for example, in the last data set in 2020, there was a $50 million museum grant. That was the largest award. Whereas in 2021, the largest grant for a museum was a $12 million operating support award from the Broad Art Foundation to the Broad. So a substantially smaller amount. This will be interesting. I don't necessarily think this is a long-term trend, but we'll see. I do want to say, though, for multi-purpose arts, or we also call multidisciplinary arts, the largest grant, that $115 million grant, came into this category. But let me just describe what that includes. It's multidisciplinary centers, arts councils, artist services, arts administration, arts exchange, and arts education, although not performing arts education. That is included within performing arts. And so this $115 million award was from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to the Tide Center to support Creatives Rebuild New York, which is a 3-year initiative to support the financial stability of New York State artists and the organizations that employ them. Other arts is the other big category at the bottom of the chart that also accounted for 32% of the grant dollars. The vast majority of funding within other arts are grants that simply say for the arts. They're unspecified, they're indicated for the arts, but there's no additional details. So that's what's being captured there. And then finally, in terms of my remarks, just want to take a quick look at giving for arts and culture by type of support strategy. And this has been a really interesting one to me, and definitely one that will require several more years of data to understand what exactly is happening. So in this slide, the blue bars are showing share of grant dollars. The green bars are showing share of number of grants or percent of number of grants. I'm illustrating this, the arts and culture funding for program support, general support, and capital support. Well, what was so interesting to me when I looked at the 2020 data was that the shares of dollars going for both program and general support, unrestricted support, had gone up so markedly. So for program support, for example, the share of grant dollars had gone from 31% up to 43%, and now is at 46% as of the 2021 data. For share of number of grants of program support, it jumped from 31% to 39%, and now up to 45%. All right. Meanwhile, for general support, that had increased from 24% to 31% of grant dollars and is now 32%. And then from 25% to 39% of grant dollars, although it's slightly less at 38%, but pretty much the same, held roughly steady. The challenge with this, and particularly based on share of number of grants, is, as I mentioned, the shares of numbers of grants aren't being impacted by a particularly large award, which can definitely affect shares of grant dollars. And typically, shares of numbers of grants do not change that dramatically from year to year. So moreover, I mean, something that I've seen with the 2021 data is when we look at the shares of funding for unrestricted support based on the overall grant dollars, it's also showing 38% of the number of grants providing unrestricted support. Now, that's very surprising to me because for years, the arts has really led in terms of emphasizing the importance of providing unrestricted support. It's been real leaders consistently across decades provided a larger share of funding as unrestricted support compared to overall foundation giving. So this is highly unusual. At the same time, 2021 and 2020 were nothing but highly unusual years. So anecdotally, we know there was an unprecedented increase in unrestricted support. I think the question is going to be, will this last? Or will when we have the 2022, 2023 data going forward, will these shares come back down, particularly for unrestricted support? That's the question in my mind, because it's highly unusual and I can't fully explain it. So that said, there's much more in the snapshot report. Absolutely looking forward to the conversation and questions at the end of the program. But with that, I will now turn you over to Ryan to talk about the state arts agency's data. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. Fascinating stuff. Hey, everyone. I'm Ryan Stubbs. I'm the Senior Director of Research at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, or NASAA. Thanks again to grant makers in the arts for inviting us to participate in this important research again. I'm mainly here to introduce my colleagues, Nakyung Rhee and Mohja Rhoads, who continue to do excellent work to track public funding for the arts and administering NASAA's survey on state arts agency revenues. Now, NASAA is the professional association for the nation's 56 state arts agencies, and our mission is to strengthen state arts agencies. So therefore, NASAA's funding and grant-making knowledge is deepest at the state level. But as you'll learn today, public funding for the arts includes connective tissue between local, state, and federal agencies. The federal and local data presented today come from our partners at the National Endowment for the Arts and Americans for the Arts. We've also learned the important role just now that foundations play in funding the arts ecosystem in the United States. And hopefully one takeaway from today is the essential role that both public and private arts funders have in supporting artists, arts activities, and cultural experiences in communities across the country. So with that, I will hand things over to Mohja.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mohja Rhoads, and I am the research manager at NASAA. And Nakyung and I will both be presenting today. My portion will take a closer look at grant making at each of the levels of the public funding ecosystem, and Nakyung will be covering trends. And before I begin, I did want to plug NASAA's research. Most of the data that I will be presenting come from our grant-making fact sheets, and that can be found on our website under research. And most of the work done here also was done by Nakyung Rhee, so I would like to acknowledge that. So I like to use the analogy of the transportation network when talking about the public funding ecosystem for the arts, because they are very different animals, but they function in the same way. And any individual on any given day is going to use a variety of networks in the transportation system that pertain to the local, state, and federal systems via roads, via trains, via planes, via buses. And as can be seen to the left, each level of government contributes financially to the network of highways and transit. So it's a nice little metaphor to use when thinking about the public funding ecosystem of the arts. So the three levels, federal, state, and local systems form the public funding ecosystem for the arts, and they're all connected via real dollars. And real dollars are matched at each level, and this connection is made through granting and re-granting. But it is also, and that is what I will be discussing, is the grant making, but it is also important to acknowledge the leadership role each of these levels makes and contributes, and how each level learns from each other in its leadership capacity. And so, for example, the NEA plays a critical role in the arts sector through knowledge and programs, contributing research to help understand the benefits and value of arts and cultural production. And the NEA also sets federal priorities. One recently is the catalyzing of cross-sector initiatives, which has been also seen at the state and local level. So leadership is as important as the dollars themselves. So why is public funding necessary? It's a basic question. And one of the answers is that philanthropic and foundation giving to the arts has been found to be geographically disproportionate and concentrated in large awards. So the public sector does serve a very important role in delivering funds to rural communities, underfunded communities, and smaller organizations. Public sector funding can also ensure that public investment aligns with public interest and flexibly responds to communities in times of need, as we have seen over the course of the past few years with the pandemic. Okay, so starting at the federal level, the National Endowment for the Arts, the budget for the NEA constitutes 0.003% of the federal budget. And so this is a very important statistic to use as you see fit. So the NEA program funds are split into two categories. 60% goes to direct grant making and 40% goes to partnership agreements with states and regions. In the 60% that goes to direct grant making, on average, that results in about 2,300 direct grants to small and medium-sized organizations. That's defined as organizations with budgets up to $2 million. And that these are granted in every congressional district in the country. This grant making reaches about 4,000 communities. 35% of the grants go to high poverty communities and 11% goes to rural communities. So now moving on to the state level, state arts agencies. These data come from FY20. They're it's the fullest data set that we have. So it's the newest and fullest that we have in terms of SAA grant making. So on average, legislative appropriations to states represent on average around 0.049% of state general fund expenditures. So for fiscal year 2020, the combined revenue of all states was around $600 million. 7% was represented as NEA contributions. And while most of the contributions do come from states themselves, the NEA contributions are still very important for many states. They represent half of the arts budget. So for 2020, 86% came from state contributions and 7% from other places, including private organizations. This resulted for fiscal year 2020 around 30,000 grants to organizations. So operating support is a major component of SAA grant making, and operating support is very important because it provides flexible and unrestricted funding to organizations, which is not available through the NEA. And many communities will not have philanthropic support or local arts agencies that can provide this either. So SAAs serve a critical role in delivering this kind of support to organizations throughout the US. And it's also important because it also constitutes the largest of the grant making pie. The largest percentage of the grant making pie in SAAs does go to operating support. So for 2020, 41% of SAA grant dollars went to operating support for arts organizations, reaching around 4,000 communities, with a median award of around $7,000. 85% of GOS grants were awarded to organizations with budgets under 1 million, and 23% of these organizations were located in a rural setting. This map does a very nice job of showing the reach of operating support grants to small organizations. This can be seen by the aqua color. Spreads out, reaches a larger geographical distribution to small grants than it does to large grants. So it's a nice visual representation, and also for the islands and the regions. So this slide is about shared grantees with federal and state shared grantees. And we can see visually a couple of things. One is the scope of SAA grant and RAO grant making is large, and a fair amount of the NEA grantees also received awards from SAAs and RAOs. So from fiscal years 2016 to 2020, around 3,204 grantees received both NEA and SAA and RAO funding. It's resulted in around 33,000 awards, reaching over 3,000 communities in 726 counties across the 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. So 74% of NEA direct grantees also receive awards from SAAs and RAOs, and around 11% of SAAs and RAOs receive NEA awards. So moving on to the local level, local arts agencies, these data here come from fiscal year 2019. In 2019, 30% of LAAs were branches of municipal or county governments, while the remaining 70% were incorporated as private nonprofits. Of LAA revenue, around 28% comes from local governments, 27% from corporate support and private donations and grants. 23% come from earned income, came for 2019 from earned income, and around 12% from state and federal funds. And so in terms of SAA support for LAA activities, the bulk of the support that SAAs give to LAAs goes to re-granting. So LAAs then re-grant to their communities. So for fiscal year 2020, SAAs invested almost 40 million in LAAs for a total of 1,500 grants. And for the period of fiscal year 2016 to 2020, around 1,500 LAA grantees received funds from both the NEA and SAAs. So while there are a fair amount of LAAs, local governments alone can't fully support the arts. There are around 4,500 local arts agencies throughout the US, yet there are around 91,000 local governments, and this number does include school districts. And only a small percentage of LAAs serve multiple counties or cities, and many local arts agencies have very small budgets or are purely all volunteer. So a symbiotic relationship exists amongst all three levels, each of which contributes critical funds, leadership, knowledge, and partnerships. And with that, I will pass it on to Nakyung, who will be discussing trends.
Thank you, Mohja. I'm Nakyung. I'm Research Associate at NASAA. I'm pleased to share an overview of the public arts funding, drawing insight from fiscal year 2023 and 2024. For those joining us again, you may recall our commentary last year on the significant art funding increases in 2022, rebounding after declines during the pandemic. I'm happy to share that these record-breaking trends continue into 2023, despite wider economic pressure throughout the year. You will likely hear more exclamation of record high again. Of course, the past 2 years of unprecedented art funding can be attributed to recovering economies and continued spending from federal pandemic relief programs. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 continued playing pivotal role in 2023, directing $135 million to the National Endowment for the Arts and state art and jurisdictional art agencies. This vital support flows to local art organizations and programs in communities, helping the arts sector navigate challenging times and bounce back. So the impact of federal support was evident in 2023 NEA appropriation, which saw a remarkable 15% increase to a record $207 million. The last time we witnessed this level of increase was back in 2008, just before the Great Recession dealt a major blow to funding. State art agencies also experienced a notable growth in FY23 with an average increase of 16.5% to a record high $971 million in appropriations. Some states saw even higher percentile jump of 100% or more compared to their previous year. These increases can be attributable to one-time appropriation from federal and state relief or special funding, and this substantial infusion of funds expanded state art agencies' reach and impact in community across their states. At the local level, art agencies anticipated a historic 32.7% surge in funding to over $1 billion for the first time ever. This figure may not reflect the reality of every single local agency, but this record investment came at a crucial time as rising inflation and costs underscored the additional support need for art organizations and artists to sustain their operations. So substantial funding through early pandemic relief and the American Rescue Plan Act, as most recently, has helped build this need by supporting art operations and rebuilding local art ecosystems post-pandemic. Despite economic uncertainties, support for the arts grew at all levels of government, as we just observed, and appropriation reached a new record high at each level. So the total from federal, state, and local public funding sources reached an impressive $2.2 billion for the arts in FY23, and this demonstrates a positive trend showing the public sector's commitments to reinvigorating the arts sector. And even after accounting for inflation, this $2.2 billion represents a 6% increase compared to 2001. Let me show the other slide again. So, well, this chart only shows data from 2004, but 2001 has stood as a history record high point for comparison since then. Inflation always clouds the picture, but there was a minimal but real growth happened even in the today's economic climate. And the total funding equals $6.83 per capita when divided across the population. Federal source contributed 62 cents per person, approaching almost $1 per capita. States gave $2.90 per person, and local source provided $3.32 per capita. Compared to the 2020 per capita data here, this number comes from the increase needed by public support. Looking ahead, 2024 projections indicate potential decreases as relief funds went down. NASAA data suggests a 24% drop in state art agency appropriations this year, attributed to the transitions out of the temporary federal and state aid. However, even with slowing growth, aggregated funding would still exceed the pre-pandemic level by over 50%, adjusted for inflation, but it demonstrates the substantial ground gained through relief efforts and advocacy. And NASAA will publish our FY24 revenue data next month, so please look out for the report if it is released. And as of now, and as many of you are aware, that any aid funding for 2024 remains unresolved due to the congressional impasses. Art organizations nationwide continue advocating for strong NEA support. In the latest developments, the Senate proposed level funding of $207 million, and the House proposed a 10% budget reduction. NASAA's Legislative Counsel, Isaac Brown, will provide legislative updates, so please follow our communications if interest. Also, local 2024 data isn't yet available, but anticipating revenue on par with 2023, we expect about 10% total decrease in 2024 art funding, mainly because of depleted federal pandemic aid. However, the total would still exceed pre-pandemic level in 2020 or 2021. So in summary, the past 2 years showcased the encouraging boost in public art funding, but work remained to maintain this momentum as the economy normalizes. Sustaining public support relies on all levels of government, and the art sector's resilience coupled with the strategic advocacy and education will be crucial for sustained growth despite all kinds of uncertainties ahead. So thank you all for your time and attention. And I will now hand things over to Charlene for questions.
All right, thank you so much. We were gonna take some time to do a little bit of a group reflection with all of our presenters, but I think we'll go right into Q&A, just considering our time. So if all of our presenters want to come on back and hang out as we get into the questions. So keep them coming, folks. And I'm actually going to start off with one for you, Stephen. You already answered it during your presentation, but in case folks join late and want to know, and they're reading through the report and they want to understand some of the language, can you just repeat again what you mean by operating foundation?
Right. So operating foundations, J. Paul Getty Trust is a good example. Most of their resources are being used to fund the Getty Center, and they have people on staff who are conducting research, arts curators, and historians. However, some operating foundations also do have small grant-making programs. So basically that's representing private foundations that are primarily fulfilling their charitable mission by running their own programs.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephen, for clarifying that. I'm going to kick it over to our public funder representatives here, research representatives, and acknowledge it's been a rock star year for GOS support, right? At the state level, at the local level, it's all around seems like things are pretty rock star. And so 2 questions. One, can you say it again, just for folks who, I think some folks were kind of thinking about this, why you saw the jump? Like, why did we see that jump? Like, what can that be attributed to? And also, do you expect that because of the reasons that you're about to share, that we can see that either continue to increase next year or like maintain that high level of GOS giving? If you could just respond to that. I feel like that's a Nakyung question just because you were the one who spoke about it, but it's of course for all 3 of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to just say a couple things, and then Nakyung or Mohja, if you want to jump in as well. So, I think obviously a large factor for the increase in public support had to do with federal and state aid related to the pandemic, including ARP funds that were expended in various ways in communities, but also I think there was a lot of trust put into public agencies who are grant-making agencies to administer these funds, to administer relief funds, and I believe that helped build trust in the value of public sector arts agencies to sustain communities in times of economic consternation, let's say. So I think that's an ongoing factor as those funds dwindle out. I think, Nakyung explained that we were starting to see things come down a little bit, but I think also given the the trust that was put into public sector agencies and the impact that was seen in communities. Hopefully, this also means continued trust from legislatures in public arts agencies.
Great, that's great, Ryan. Nakyung, Mohja, do you want to chime in or feeling all right? So we're going to hop on back over to you, Stephen. We're getting some questions here. Have the top 1,000, so, Foundation 1,000 funders always accounted for only 2/5 of all arts funding? How many additional philanthropic funders would be needed to do analysis that accounts for 3/5 of all giving?
A lot. And so I'll say, back 10, 15 years ago, the Foundation 1000 accounted for about half of overall foundation giving. So just the fact that you've got blockbuster funders like the Gates Foundation included in the Foundation 1000, and nonetheless, you're still at 2/5 of giving, just speaks to the fact that the world of foundation philanthropy has just grown so large. So there would be a way to calculate an exact figure, but just to give you an armchair guess, I'm thinking to get to 3/5, you'd probably need somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 foundations. And it's one of those realities. I think Candid has really been working to automate the coding of data and to be able to capture more, but it's still, we're still not there at the point. I mean, my dream would always be to have a comprehensive look at all foundation grant making. I don't know that we're ever going to get there. Even just getting this 1,000 data set, I know for them continues to be challenging, with both delays in reporting by the IRS and delays in reporting by foundations themselves.
Yeah, that's right, Stephen. And I mean, speaking from the GIA perspective, we talk a lot about racial equity and like coding for those types of grants and that type of funding. And it's difficult. It's difficult to get that data for so many different reasons. So, you're right, is essentially what I'm saying here. So I'm going to kick it over to our public funders. I hope you can all hear me okay. So someone asks, what should we, right, funders, be paying attention to on a federal level to do our part in supporting further increase of appropriation to the arts? There needs to be another rock star year.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. I think that advocacy continues to be important. I think over the years, the strong advocacy coalitions that have been formed by those with interest in supporting the arts in the United States have helped sustain threats to the arts. And I think that support will help sustain continued investments in the arts. It will continue to be important. Obviously, Congress is considering federal funding and the federal budget at large, and so there are complicated dynamics there. But obviously, continuing to speak with your state and local representatives about the importance of the arts is important. So if you're out there and you're benefiting from an arts grant, it's important to let those legislators know that their investments are important. And so I think continuing communication and continuing seeing the data that we see that shows the valuable impact of the arts from an economic perspective, from an educational perspective, and from other civic and social perspectives. So lots of research is out there from GIA, from many of our colleague art service organizations, including NASAA. So use all those tools and research that you can to help continuing to relay the message of the importance of the arts.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to kind of pull things back a little bit and ask you all a question together so that we can kind of hear your perspectives on this. So how do the public and private sector complement each other and or affect the data? Your perspective.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off. Sorry, if I'm taking up too much bandwidth here, but
Love hearing from you,
I
Ryan.
just want to, I think there are essential roles, that I think we heard over the course of the presentation about the ability for public arts agencies to reach many areas and those are both urban and rural areas that may be underserved. So there are public goals to serve an entire population and in entire jurisdictions. So that's an important role of public funding. For private foundations, obviously, there's many important roles in terms of the amount of dollars that they can expend, the variety and innovative programming that they can do that helps lead the conversation. Whereas, given public dollars and accountability associated with that, sometimes there can be less, or public funders may need to be more risk adverse than private funders can be on the whole. So obviously, there's more demand for art services and people wanting to participate in arts and culture and communities and everywhere. So that demand is still, I think with the funding that we have is still not being met, right? So we know that the need is greater than the total amount available for artists and creative practitioners. So the combined efforts are definitely needed.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything Ryan said. And I think one way I think about foundation giving and its role, there's the investment capital, as Ryan said, it's much more flexible. It can be riskier. It's also more stable. Because I have to say, looking at the state's arts, at the sources of local, state, and federal funding for the arts, and looking at that drop off, which certainly we're seeing in education, we're going to see in a lot of other areas. And also just, looking back at the trend lines where economic downturn comes and suddenly those public dollars go down, they dip and they take a while to come back. And what's the cost to organizations having to contend with that variability? Foundations have been important in terms of providing a more stable source of support, because even in downtimes, their giving is not going to change as dramatically. And funders tend to be committed to those priorities. I also think, though, that's where I get particularly concerned about the, say, decreasing share of funders supporting the art and the fact that funding for arts and culture by foundations hasn't kept pace, because it's not going to be playing that same kind of stabilizing role. And there's a real question as to what it is about arts and culture and the way we think about it that, clearly is still seen as a priority for public funders, but may not be seen as quite such a priority by private funders. So I think there's a real opportunity for some learning across those sectors to understand how we engage private philanthropy, newer private philanthropy in supporting arts and culture.
That's great. Thank you both. We've got time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to direct one of these and then we'll do our kind of final closing. So someone submitted this one, John T. Exciting to see sustained increases in operating grants. Any insights on arts economic development support for individual artists or developing marketplaces for them to sell?
I think I can just speak to that briefly, right? So there's we see the priority of operating support, which we know that arts organizations need, I think, especially in the pandemic, when it was partially about keeping on the lights and keeping things, keeping people employed, was a big priority. I think that there are lots of programs that foundations and state arts agencies fund that help support individual artists. I think we have on our grant making fact sheets, we have a support for individual artists, and I believe it's around 9% of state arts agency dollars are going to support individual artists. So that's a sustained investment over time. But there's also programs and policies such as creative districts, where agencies are looking to spur investment in communities through the proliferation of arts businesses, nonprofits, and working together for places for people to come together and have those experiences that they value.
That's great. Thank you for that. And I'm glad that we were able to get some conversation around individual artists included into our conversation. So as we wrap up, it's just about to be the top of the hour. What are your final words? This is your mic drop moment. Anything you would like folks to hold on to until we have our funder snapshot next year. Any recommendations are food for thought. Invite all of you to share from your perspective.
I'll just throw in my, this is my soapbox moment. I think the arts are critical to advancing social justice and racial equity in this country, all forms of equity in this country. And I don't know that that message is reaching beyond really highly informed folks. And I just think there's a lot of opportunity for creative thinking around how to draw that connection and really and do more, because I think that's really, when I think about foundation funding for the arts, there's so many funders who really want to make a difference and make social change. And the arts is critical to that. It's not going to happen without the arts. So I just think those connections need to be drawn more clearly whenever possible.
That's great. Thanks for that, Stephen. I heard a call to action in there, so thank you for that.
Thank you for letting me get on my soapbox.
Yes, of course. Mohja, Nakyung, Ryan.
That was a very nice ending. I like it, Stephen.
Right.
I like it too. I think that's a good place to end, and I don't have anything else to add.
All right. Nakyung, I don't want to miss you in case you've got a burning comment that you want to share.
Well, ditto, and that was great cutting.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you all for your incredible presentations. It's always such a pleasure to have you, and we all get very excited about discussing and reading the reports that you both provide and put together for us. So thank you, thank you. This presentation will be recorded. You will receive the slides, and on the last page of the slide deck, you'll see the contact information of our presenters, because there were some questions we didn't get to, but you can feel free to reach out to our presenters directly if you still want to ask your question. Also in the chat, we have our survey, so please take the survey and let us know what you thought, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all so much, and have a lovely day. Bye.
Thanks, Sherilyn. Thanks, GIA.